At 2:10 in the afternoon on January the 26th, 1945, near the French village of Holtzwihr, a 20-year-old lieutenant from Texas stood alone on top of a burning American tank destroyer. Snow and smoke blurred the tree line in front of him. Through that grey curtain, roughly 250 German infantrymen and several tanks were pushing forward, closing on the position his company had just abandoned. The lieutenant's name was Audie Murphy, 5'5", barely over 110 pounds when he first tried to enlist. A kid the army had once looked at and quietly labelled too small to fight. Now every man from Company B, 15th Infantry Regiment. 3rd Division was behind him in the woods, pulling back under his orders, out on the open ground. The only thing between those German troops and his battered company was a single, undersized figure outlined against fire and steel. Beneath his boots, the disabled M10 tank destroyer hissed and snapped as flames licked around the turret. Fuel burned, paint blistered. Inside the hull, 3-inch shells and 50 caliber belts cooked off in random cracks and bangs. The vehicle was no longer a weapon. It was a steel coffin waiting to detonate, bolted to the turret ring above that fire, fixed in place and pointing out over the snow. Was the one thing Audie Murphy refused to leave behind a Browning M2 50 caliber machine gun with a clear field of fire and a full belt of ammunition. In front of him, German infantry were spreading out, using the folds in the ground, moving in and around their supporting tanks. Panzer crews knew exactly what a 50 cal on an elevated mount could do to exposed men and soft-skinned vehicles. Machine gun teams began to set up. Rifles and submachine guns probed for his range. Somewhere behind them, artillery officers were already calculating how far they needed to walk shells to erase the stubborn American holdouts in the woods. Murphy could have turned and run with his men. Nobody would have blamed the smallest officer in the company for getting off a burning tank destroyer before the ammunition inside turned it into a crater. Instead, he pressed the radio handset to his ear, started calling in artillery on the German advance, and wrapped his right hand around the spade grips of the 50 cal. For the next hour, that too small Texas farm kid would use one burning wreck, one machine gun, and one field telephone to hold off around 250 German soldiers long enough for his company to survive. If you want to see how a man the army almost turned away as too small ended up stopping roughly 250 Germans by himself, go ahead and hit that like button and consider subscribing to WW2 Echo Stories so you don't miss what happens next. It's a simple way to help keep real World War II moments like this from disappearing into the algorithm. To understand how Audie Murphy ever wound up on that burning tank destroyer in the first place, we have to start long before Holtzwihr, back on a worn-out farm in Texas. Audie Leon Murphy grew up a long way from France and armored warfare. He was born in rural Texas, one of 12 children on a worn-out patch of farm ground that never produced quite enough food or money. By 10, he was working sunup to sundown in the fields, and then heading into the woods with a .22 rifle to bring home rabbits and squirrels so his younger brothers and sisters could eat. Hitting a small target at unknown ranges wasn't sport for him. It was the difference between supper and going hungry. At 16, his father walked out. A few years later, his mother died. The family scattered. For a small, quiet kid who had spent his childhood carrying more than his share of weight, the war in Europe and the Pacific didn't feel like an adventure. It felt like a way out and, maybe, a way to send money home. When he first tried to enlist, the Marine Corps said no. The paratroopers said no. The Navy said no. He was too light, too short, too young. Finally, the U.S. Army took him almost as an afterthought. In boot camp and early training, instructors and fellow recruits took one look at the baby-faced Texan and assumed he'd fold under real fire. He didn't. In Sicily, in Italy, and later in southern France. Audie Murphy quietly built a record of calm, precise violence under pressure, before Holtzwihr, before that burning tank destroyer in the snow. The too small kid from Texas had already learned that nobody was coming to save him or his men. If something needed doing, he would have to stand up and do it himself. By January 1945, the 3rd Infantry Division was nobody's idea of a fresh unit. They had gone ashore in North Africa, fought up through Sicily, bled in the Italian mountains, and then hit the beaches again in southern France. They were what American commanders called a veteran formation, and what the men themselves understood as tired but still moving. When they got orders to shift into the Colmar pocket in Alsace, they weren't walking into a clean slate. They were walking into a corner of the Western Front the Germans had refused to give up. The Colmar pocket was a bulge of German-held territory south of Strasbourg, on the west bank of the Rhine, on a map. It looked like an untidy wedge poking into Allied lines. On the ground, it was a knot of villages, vineyards, rivers, and frozen fields defended by infantry, tanks, and whatever artillery the Wehrmacht could scrape together, if the Allies wanted a solid front along the Rhine before pushing into Germany. That wedge had to be cut off and flattened for the men on the line. The most obvious feature of the Colmar pocket wasn't the shape of the front. It was the weather. The winter of 1944-45 in Alsace was brutal. Snow packed into the fields and woods. Slush and frozen mud clogged every track and country road. Fog and low clouds came and went without warning, throttling air support and making reconnaissance unreliable. Cold worked into fingers and rifle bolts. Vehicles that had survived 2 campaigns now broke down because oil thickened and metal cracked. The Germans understood the terrain and the weather as well as the Americans did. They also understood that this pocket was one of their last footholds on the French side of the Rhine. If they could hold it, they could threaten Allied crossings and delay any push into southern Germany. So they fought for it with a mix of what they had left veteran infantry, inexperienced replacements, and armored units pulled together from different formations. The 15th Infantry Regiment, Audie Murphy's regiment, was tasked with advancing through this mess and holding ground around small villages that most Americans back home would never hear about. One of those villages was Holtzwihr, a cluster of houses and farm buildings bordered by woods and open fields. It was not a fortress. It was just one more piece of ground that controlled approaches to other pieces of ground. But in a winter campaign, each of those small pieces mattered. Company B's job near Holtzwihr was simple on paper and dangerous in practice. Hold the edge of a stretch of woods that looked out over open, snow-covered farmland toward the village and the routes the Germans were using to counterattack. If German infantry and tanks punched through that thin American line, they wouldn't just overrun one company. They could drive a wedge into the regiment, isolate nearby units, and roll up the flank of the attack on the pocket, to give the infantry at least some answer to German armor. Tank destroyers from a supporting battalion were attached to the position. One of those was the M10 that would later be burning under Audie Murphy's boots. The doctrine was clear enough. The infantry would dig in at the tree line, use the forest for cover, and call on the M10s to engage any tanks that showed themselves in the open, if a heavy attack came. They were to delay it as long as they could and then fall back in an orderly way to secondary positions, on a chalkboard, surrounded by arrows and symbols. That plan made sense. In the field, the math looked different. Company B was under strength from months of fighting, weapons jammed in the cold if they weren't cleaned constantly. Men were exhausted, not just from marching and digging, but from the kind of fatigue that comes from being on the edge of combat too many days in a row. And the enemy had a vote. When German reconnaissance and forward observers identified the American positions, they weren't going to stage a neat, limited attack. They were going to try to crush the line. Murphy, now a lieutenant and effectively the key officer for Company B in that sector, could see what his men were up against. The woods gave some cover, but beyond the tree line, the ground dipped and rolled gently toward Holtzwihr. It was good tank country, if German armor broke through with infantry swarming around it. There wasn't much room for the Americans to maneuver. They would either stand and fight on poor terms, or pull back and risk opening a hole in the line. In briefing after briefing, the message from higher headquarters was consistent: expect counterattacks. The Germans were not done. They still had tanks in the area. They still had artillery. They still had officers willing to drive their companies forward through snow and fire to hit any exposed American position. The 3rd Division had beaten German units before. That wasn't the problem. The problem was timing. A counterattack at the wrong moment could catch units spread out, low on ammunition, or in the middle of rotating companies. On the morning of January 26th, the warning signs began to stack up. Patrols reported German movement. Artillery rounds probed the area around the woods and the approaches to Holtzwihr. Intermittent small arms fire tested the American line, looking for weak spots. The M10s moved into their firing positions. Infantry checked their foxholes, machine gun emplacements, and ammunition. Men who had been cold and tired an hour before now felt that particular kind of alertness that only comes when you know someone on the other side is about to try to kill you. The essential problem was brutally simple. Company B was a thin, veteran line stretched across the edge of a forest, backed by a handful of tank destroyers, facing an enemy that still had the ability to mass infantry and armor. The division needed that line to hold long enough for the wider attack on the Colmar pocket to keep moving. If the Germans broke through here, they would not just knock over one company, they would punch a gap into the side of an entire regimental front. Audie Murphy understood that. He also understood something else that wouldn't show up on any official map or situation report. In a winter fight like this, where visibility changed by the hour and radio traffic was never perfect, there came moments when formal plans stopped mattering and the outcome depended on one decision, made by one person, in one place, near Holtzwihr. On that day, the place was the edge of the woods. The person was the smallest officer in Company B. The attack did not begin with a dramatic trumpet blast. It started the way most bad days on the line begin, with shapes in the distance that did not belong there. Around midday on January the 26th, observers from Company B picked up movement near Holtzwihr. Dark figures against white fields, the glint of metal where there should have been only snow and dead vines. A few minutes later, the sharper, heavier clatter of tracked vehicles came rolling in over the normal background noise of artillery and small arms. German armor was on the move. Reports went up the chain quickly. Murphy and the other leaders in the sector got the same message: enemy tanks and infantry were forming up for an attack toward their slice of the woods. There was no talk of a small probe. This looked like a serious push. Company B's infantry were in foxholes and shallow trenches along the edge of the tree line. Ahead of them, in the open, the attached M10s were pulled into hull-down positions as best the terrain allowed, angled to get shots at anything that broke into the fields. The plan was simple. Let the Germans show themselves. Let the tank destroyers hit the armor, and use mortar and small arms fire to break up the infantry. For a few minutes, that plan held. German infantry began to fan out from Holtzwihr, using low ground and hedgerows. Tanks, self-propelled guns or panzers, depending on who was looking, moved with them, using the village and clumps of trees for cover. American artillery answered with harassing fire, dropping shells ahead of the advance, forcing the Germans to slow or change direction. The M10s fired when they could see targets, their 3-inch guns sending armor-piercing rounds across the snow. But the Germans kept coming. They had chosen their axis of attack carefully. The ground in front of Company B offered long, clear fields of fire for the defenders, but it offered the same to the attackers once they got close enough. As the range closed, German artillery and mortars bracketed the American positions, walking fire back toward the woods. Shells exploded in and around the foxholes, showering men with snow, dirt, and splinters of wood. One of the M10s took a direct hit or a near miss that was just as bad. The blast disabled the vehicle and touched off a fire inside the hull. The crew bailed out, dropping off the sides and running for the cover of the trees as flames began to pour from the open turret. The tank destroyer that had been part of the company's thin anti-armor shield a moment before was now a burning wreck in front of their line. Through the smoke and snow, Murphy could see more German infantry moving up behind the tanks, filling in the gaps. The volume of incoming fire was climbing. Rounds were hitting the tree line, snapping branches and cutting into the earth around the foxholes. The fire from the American positions was not stopping the advance. It was only slowing it. At some point in that crunch of decisions, shells landing. Radios crackling. Men shouting over the noise, Murphy got the order he had been expecting. With German armor pressing in and infantry massing, higher headquarters authorized Company B to pull back from the exposed edge of the woods to a more defensible line deeper among the trees. It was a standard response to a heavy attack trade ground for survival. Reorganize and fight again from a better position. On paper, it made sense. On the ground, Murphy saw the gap that retreat would open. If the entire company pulled back at once, there would be a window minutes, maybe more, when the German tanks and infantry could move unopposed through the space between the burning M10 and the tree line. Once they got into the woods, they could roll right over the new positions before they were properly set. Murphy made a different choice. He ordered his men to fall back into the woods, just as the higher-ups wanted, but he told them he was staying forward. He wanted every rifleman, every machine gun team, every mortar crew he could spare back in the trees, digging in, turning around, and getting ready to meet whatever came through the smoke. Someone had to stay between them and that whatever. The burning M10 gave him an answer that no manual would have suggested. The vehicle was a total loss. The main gun was out of action. Fire was already chewing through paint and wiring. Ammunition inside the hull was starting to cook off in small, sharp bursts. Most men would have treated it as a hazard to get away from. Murphy saw something else. The wreck sat slightly ahead of the infantry line, elevated just enough to give a clear view over the open ground. Its steel hull and turret still offered some cover from small arms fire coming from the front, and bolted to the top of that turret, still intact, was a Browning .50 caliber machine gun with a full belt of ammunition hanging from its feed tray. He moved toward the M10 instead of away from it. To the men who saw him go, it looked insane, the smallest officer in the company, limping from previous wounds, climbing up onto a vehicle that could blow apart at any moment while enemy armor and infantry closed the distance. To Murphy, it was math. From that position, with that weapon, he could put heavy fire directly into the advancing German infantry. From that vantage point, with a field telephone or radio handset in reach, he could see where the enemy was massing and call artillery down with precision. He told the remaining men near the wreck to get back to the woods and set up their next line. They hesitated. No one wanted to leave an officer alone in the open, but he was clear. Their job was to prepare the defense. His job, now, was to buy them time to build it. Murphy climbed onto the burning tank destroyer, got his hands on the .50 cal's spade grips, and positioned himself where he could see the German advance and still duck behind what little armor the ruined turret still offered. With the radio line open to artillery and a belt of heavy machine gun ammunition ready to feed, the too small farm kid from Texas turned a wrecked M10 into his own personal strongpoint and waited for the Germans to close. The first Germans into Murphy's sights were not tanks. They were infantry dark figures spilling out from behind the village, moving across the white field in loose files, hunched low under their helmets. They were doing exactly what they had been trained to do, use what little cover the ground offered. Keep moving, and close with the American positions before artillery or machine guns could tear them apart. Murphy did exactly what he had been trained to do. He started calling for fire. From the top of the burning M10, he had a better view of the battlefield than anyone in the woods behind him. He described what he saw into the radio: German infantry forming up here, armor pushing there, a clump of men taking cover behind a hedgerow that ran like a scar across the field. He gave grid references and corrections, his voice flat and precise in the handset, as if he were at a training range and not standing on a vehicle that could explode. The first American shells landed short and to the side of the advancing line test rounds, feeling for the right section of ground. Murphy watched the bursts, saw the Germans adjust, and gave new corrections. Left, closer. The next salvo walked up into the paths the Germans were using, throwing men into the air, ripping holes in their carefully spaced formations. Then Murphy brought the .50 caliber into the fight. The Browning M2 was not a delicate weapon. It was a 40-plus pound block of steel designed to put half-inch rounds through vehicles, walls, and people at ranges where rifles started to feel uncertain. Mounted high on the M10's turret, it sat where a commander could stand behind it with his head and shoulders exposed, scanning for threats. Now there was no commander, just Murphy, feet planted on hot armor, hands closing around the spade grips. He pressed the butterfly trigger. The gun came to life with a heavy, hammering roar that cut across the sharper cracks of rifles and machine guns. The barrel walked slightly under recoil as Murphy swept it across the front ranks of the German infantry. Snow jumped where rounds struck. Men tumbled and disappeared into the white and grey. The first bursts were long, more emotion than control. But even so, they chewed gaps into the advancing line. German machine gun crews reacted, dropping prone and swinging their own weapons toward the sudden, concentrated fire. Tracers from their side reached back, streaks of red and green cutting the air around the M10. Rounds smacked into the wreck, punched into the shattered superstructure, and snapped past Murphy's head. The burning tank destroyer shuddered under impacts, under its own internal pops as loose ammunition inside continued to cook off. Murphy adjusted. He forced himself to fire shorter bursts, to walk the .50 from group to group, picking off the biggest threats, the machine gun team setting up tripods, the officers and NCOs gesturing men forward, the clusters of infantry trying to rush between shell bursts. Whenever he saw a German squad use a fold in the ground to creep closer, he raked that fold with heavy rounds until the movement stopped. Behind him, deeper in the trees, men from Company B heard the heavy gun and knew exactly who was on it. They were digging, repositioning, checking fields of fire. Every second Murphy stayed forward was another second they had to get ready. German tanks and self-propelled guns tried to answer the problem more directly. One vehicle swung its turret toward the burning M10 and fired. The shell screamed in, narrowly missing the wreck and detonating nearby, showering the area with dirt, snow, and fragments of steel. The blast rocked the tank destroyer and nearly threw Murphy off the turret. He went down on one knee, the radio handset clattering against the metal beside him, ears ringing. He forced himself back up, grabbed for the radio, and gave another correction to artillery. The Germans were shifting, probing for a weaker stretch of woods. Murphy shifted with them, calling for the fire missions to follow the movement, walking shells across the field wherever he saw men clustering. Some bursts landed so close that fragments pattered against the sides of the M10 and the concussion rolled through his chest. A mortar round landed closer still. This one sent a shard of metal into his leg, hot and sharp. Pain lanced up through his thigh. He felt the warmth of blood in his boot. For a moment, the sensible choice, the purely human choice, was to drop down off the wreck and limp for the woods. To trade the burning steel coffin for a hole in the ground and a medic. Instead, he shifted his weight, gritted his teeth, and pulled the .50 cal back on target. More German infantry were moving up now, trying to use the tanks as rolling cover. They ran behind and beside the armored hulls, timing their rushes for the moments when the tank guns fired and American heads went down. Murphy focused on them. The 50 cal's rounds could not punch through heavy frontal armor, but they could tear through hatches, vision slits, and exposed crews, and they turned flesh and bone into torn, still shapes when they caught men in the open. He stitched fire along the sides of tanks whenever a commander or loader broke cover. He hammered at infantry crowded too close to the steel monsters that were supposed to shelter them. When one tank tried to angle up toward the woods, he dropped his aim to the running men at its flanks, forcing them to ground, leaving the vehicle without a protective screen of riflemen. Through gaps in the tree line, soldiers from Company B caught flashes of the scene. German troops pitching forward in the snow, tanks trying to advance into a storm of artillery and heavy machine gun fire. And on top of the burning M10, a single figure standing in the open, hunched behind the big gun, turning with it, refusing to come down. Artillery observers on the American side, hearing Murphy's corrections and the controlled rhythm of his fire in the background, understood that they were not just supporting some anonymous forward element. They were supporting a man who could see the whole field and was determined to stay there as long as it took. They responded with speed and precision, shifting batteries to match his calls, bringing more guns into the fight as the German attack unfolded. Phase 1 of the German assault ground forward anyway. It had momentum, mass, and armor behind it, but it no longer looked like a clean, coordinated push. Instead of a continuous wave, it broke into jagged chunks. Here a platoon stalled and hugged the earth under machine gun fire. There a section veered off course to avoid a curtain of shells breaking in front of them. Tanks slowed to avoid driving into craters or through lanes they could no longer see clearly. Wary of anti-tank guns or mines that might or might not be there. From his perch, Murphy could read those hesitations. Every time the Germans paused, he punished them. Every time they tried to regroup behind a hedgerow or along a fence line, he called for artillery to tear that shelter apart and then swept the survivors with the 50. His world narrowed to 3 things: the field in front of him, the feel of the spade grips in his hands, and the voice on the other end of the radio line asking for the next set of coordinates. 10 minutes stretched into 20. 20 blurred toward 30. Time did not feel like clock time on that wreck. It felt like a series of micro-decisions: shift left, fire, adjust range, change targets, duck, stand, call for fire, fire again. Somewhere in that blur, the first phase of the German attack lost its shape. They had not been defeated. They had not broken and run. But the clean, hard punch they had tried to drive into the American line had turned into something else, a slog against a line that would not quite give way, anchored by one impossible position that refused to die. In the woods behind him. Company B finished digging in along their new line. Machine guns were emplaced. Riflemen checked sectors of fire and swapped out magazines with stiff, numb fingers. Mortar teams laid in their tubes, ready to drop rounds on any Germans who made it through the maelstrom at the edge of the field. Men looked at one another, at the trees, at the thin snow over the frozen earth, and understood that their chance of holding back whatever came next depended on how much longer that single man on the burning M10 could keep the enemy focused on him instead of them. Phase 1 of the fight for Holtzwihr had done nothing to change how big Audie Murphy was on a medical chart. It had changed something else entirely: the balance of time. The Germans had already paid far more minutes, and far more men, than they expected just to reach the starting line of the next push. The first German push had lost its rhythm, but it had not lost its intent. Out in the fields beyond Holtzwihr, officers and NCOs shouted new orders, regrouped men behind bits of cover, and tried to turn a stalled assault back into a coherent attack. They knew there was only a thin line of Americans in the trees. They also knew that as long as that machine gun on the burning tank destroyer kept firing and artillery kept hammering, nobody was walking across that snow without paying for every step. Phase 2 began when they tried to change the geometry, instead of a broad front. German infantry started moving in smaller packets, using whatever concealment they could find. Some hugged the shallow ditches that edged farm tracks. Others slipped into the dead stubble of vineyards and tried to work their way forward between the rows. Tanks and self-propelled guns shifted positions, firing from different angles, looking for a shot that would finally silence the 50 cal and the man behind it. Murphy saw them adjusting and adjusted with them. He had been on enough battlefields to recognize the pattern: initial shock, resistance, then the enemy's attempt to adapt. From his perch he watched for the telltale signs: small clusters of men breaking off, tanks pivoting, muzzle flashes popping up where there had been none before. Each time he spotted one of those movements, he had two tools to answer it: the radio and the Browning. When he saw infantry trying to crawl up a drainage ditch, he gave the fire direction center a new line of coordinates that walked shells down that ditch like a zipper. When a self-propelled gun edged out from behind a building to find a new firing position, he warned the artillery that an armored target was exposed, and then raked the infantry around it with 50 caliber fire. The heavy rounds tore into the thin-skinned vehicles supporting the tanks and chewed apart gun crews who thought they were hidden behind low walls. German gunners tried to put an end to it with weight of fire. Mortars thumped, sending arcs of explosives toward the wreck. Artillery pieces farther back in the pocket joined in, their shells landing with deeper, uglier crashes that shook the ground and showered the burning M10 with dirt and debris. One barrage landed close enough that a fragment smashed into the radio handset and stunned Murphy, momentarily filling his ears with a high, shrill ringing. For a few seconds, the battlefield went quiet from his perspective. No distinct sounds, just a roaring pressure and the taste of smoke. He found himself lying flat on the turret, cheek against hot steel, the 50 cal's grips somewhere above him. Instinct and repetition pulled him back into motion. He groped for the radio, found the handset hanging by its cord, and realized the casing was cracked. He shook his head, blinked until shapes snapped back into focus, and reached for the machine gun instead. If he couldn't talk to the guns for a moment, he could still use his own. German infantry had taken advantage of the barrage to move. When his vision cleared, they were closer, much closer, spotted figures, no longer in the middle of the open field, but within a couple hundred yards, using shell holes and the bodies of their own dead as cover. Some were setting up light machine guns. Others were preparing to rush. Murphy brought the 50 up and squeezed the trigger. The gun answered with its blunt, familiar roar. He swept the muzzle in tight arcs, cutting into the pockets of men who were trying to gather strength for one last bound toward the woods. A machine gun team went down before they could settle their weapon on its bipod. A group of riflemen who had just risen to run folded back into the snow in a staggered wave. The tanks advanced again, this time more cautiously, inching forward, halting to fire, then moving again. One vehicle turned its main gun directly on the burning M10 and fired. The round struck close enough that the blast tore a chunk out of the wreck's side and sent a sheet of flame out through the turret. The concussion slammed into Murphy like a physical blow. Heat washed up around his legs. For a moment he thought the entire vehicle had finally gone up, and that the next thing he would see would be nothing at all. But the M10 held together damaged. Aflame, shedding sparks and smoke, but still a single piece of steel under his boots. Inside, more rounds cooked off with sharp, cracking reports. Each internal explosion was a reminder that he was standing on top of a bomb that was disarming itself one shell at a time. He could have taken that as a sign to leave. Instead, he shifted his stance to keep from slipping on the scorched metal, re-anchored his wounded leg, and leaned back into the 50, down in the woods. Company B's new line was finally solid. Squads were tucked behind trees and in shallow holes. Machine gun crews had arcs of fire plotted to catch any Germans who broke through. Officers and NCOs were checking sectors, counting ammunition, and trying to read the sounds from the field, when incoming artillery slackened in one place and picked up in another. They knew Murphy had talked the guns onto a new target, when the heavy bellow of the 50 cal rose and fell. They knew he was still there. Time kept stretching. 5 minutes more, another burst of fire, another adjustment, another handful of Germans paying for each attempt to close the distance. Finally, the attack reached what soldiers sometimes call the point of diminishing returns. The Germans had thrown in companies of infantry and committed armored support. They had taken serious casualties just to get within what they thought was striking distance of the American line. Every meter forward had cost them. And still that one position in the open, the burning wreck with the machine gun on top, had not been silenced. Some attackers got within 100 yards of the woods. A few got closer. There are accounts of Germans coming within such short range that Murphy could see their faces clearly through the smoke. He continued to fire until entire belts of ammunition were gone, until there were more spent casings around his feet than whole cartridges left to feed. At some point, the belt in the 50 ran dry. He worked the charging handle, checked the feed, and realized there was nothing left to give the Browning. The big gun that had anchored the defense for nearly an hour was, for the moment, just a piece of hot metal. That was the moment to leave. Murphy slid and half fell down the side of the M10, landing hard in the snow and ash. His leg throbbed with every step as he limped back toward the tree line. Weaving through shell holes and past bodies, German fire still cracked overhead, but most of it was reaching for the woods, not the single small figure moving away from the burning wreck. The enemy's focus had shifted. They were no longer shooting primarily at him. They were shooting at the position he had bought them the time to build. When he reached the edge of the trees, men from Company B reached for him, tried to pull him down into cover. He brushed them off long enough to find a vantage point and look back over the field. What he saw was not a clean line of German troops ready for a final assault. It was a broken, scattered attack. Dead and wounded men lay across the snow in front of the woods. Some tanks and self-propelled guns were backing away, choosing survival over another drive into a killing zone they no longer understood. Artillery had done its work. The 50 cal had done its work. The German attack had been blunted so badly it no longer had the strength to punch through. Murphy did not collapse once he was off the wreck. He did what small, competent leaders in combat always do when they survive a near-suicidal stand. He went back to work. He took stock of who was where, helped reposition men, and made sure that if any Germans did try to push into the woods, they would meet organized rifle and machine gun fire instead of scattered panic. Only when it was clear that the immediate danger had passed, that the attack had truly been stopped. Not just paused did the cost of the last hour start to register. Later estimates would credit Murphy and the artillery he directed with killing or wounding dozens of German soldiers and knocking out or disabling multiple vehicles. The numbers vary depending on which report you read, but the central fact does not a German attack force of roughly 250 men, backed by armor, had been stopped cold in front of a single company's sector. Company B held. The line around Holtzwihr did not break. In the immediate aftermath, Murphy's body finally began to cash the checks his mind had written. Exhaustion, blood loss, and the cumulative shock of explosions and recoil caught up to him. Men who had watched the smallest officer in their unit stand alone on a burning tank destroyer now watched him limp, pale and shaking, along the line, still refusing to be carried to the rear. For them, the math was simple. The reason they were still in those woods, still able to fight, still alive to see the snow and the ruined fields instead of a German prison camp or a shallow grave, could be traced back to one man's decision not to leave a wreck and a machine gun when everyone else had pulled back. In the official record, what Audie Murphy did near Holtzwihr on January the 26th, 1945 became a citation. His stand on that burning M10 tank destroyer, his direction of artillery fire, and his refusal to leave the field while his men were still exposed were all folded into the language of a Medal of Honor recommendation. It noted the German force of roughly 250 men. It noted the armor. It noted that his stand allowed Company B to hold its ground and the regiment to maintain its line. That Medal of Honor would make Murphy the most highly decorated American soldier of the war. The long list of his other awards: Silver Stars, Bronze Stars, Purple Hearts ran from Sicily to Alsace, but for the men who had been in those woods behind him. All of that condensed into one picture they never forgot: a small figure standing on a burning vehicle, too stubborn to come down. After the war, Audie Murphy went home to a country that wanted heroes it could point to. He wrote a memoir, To Hell and Back, and then played himself in the film version. On screen, the kid who had once been told he was too small for combat now stood as the face of the American infantryman. He worked in Hollywood. He gave interviews. He tried to turn a battlefield reputation into a workable civilian life, but there was a cost he could never leave entirely behind. Murphy carried wounds you could see and wounds you couldn't. Nightmares, jumpiness, trouble sleeping, what we'd now call PTSD, shadowed him for the rest of his life. The same intensity that had kept him on that M10 made peacetime feel strange and brittle. Even so, he stayed engaged with veterans' issues, spoke up about what combat had done to him, and refused to dress war up as something clean. The lessons from Holtzwihr are not complicated, but they are sharp. A man everyone labeled too small to fight became the hinge of an entire sector because he was willing to stand where the math said he should not stand. Buying time can be more important than any body count. Murphy's stand was not about wiping out 250 Germans. It was about forcing them to spend so many minutes and so much blood in front of one company that the larger line never broke. Courage without communication is just a gesture. Courage with a radio, a clear view, and the judgment to use both turns one man and one machine gun into a blocking force that can hold a regiment's flank together. Stories like this are why we make WW2 Echo stories, not to glorify war, but to show what happens when one ordinary soldier refuses to do the safe thing at the critical moment. If this story about a too small Texas farm kid standing alone against roughly 250 Germans meant something to you, I'd ask you to do 3 simple things before you go. Hit the like button so this episode gets pushed out to more people who might never hear Murphy's name beyond a line in a textbook. Subscribe if you want more true World War II records about mechanics, gunners, farm kids and engineers whose decisions changed battles in ways the history books barely have room for. And most of all, share something in the comments. Let us know where you're watching from. Are you in the US, the UK, to Canada, Australia, or somewhere else entirely? If there's anyone in your family who has ever served in World War II, Iraq, Afghanistan, or anywhere in between, we'd be honored to hear about them. Or just drop a quick line so we know you're here. Every comment is a reminder that these men are still being remembered by real people, in real places, long after the shooting stopped.